A very good morning to everyone here. My name is Sandhya Kannan. I'm one of the 10 interns currently enrolled in the Dakshin Chitra internship, their 1-year diploma in Museum and Arts Management. And as part of our internship, we're giving library talks. And today is my turn. And the topic that I have chosen is in front of you. Now, a little bit about myself. I did my bachelor's BA in English here in Women's Christian College, and I went to Hyderabad for my master's. I did my MA English with a focus in culture studies and comparative literature from the English and Foreign Languages University, and I worked for a year at the Learning app as a content development, senior associate of content development, and now I'm here in Dakshin Chitra. I think the internship is a great opportunity for anyone who wants to learn a little bit more about Indian culture, heritage, art, and also for people who want to learn management, not only of museum spaces, but also of galleries, because here at Dakshin Chitra, we have a museum, and so the upkeep and work that goes into that. And you also have two wonderful galleries and other exhibition spaces that are utilized in exhibits throughout the year. So that's a little bit about me, the work we do in Dakshin Chitra and the internship. And now on to the topic. My topic is several Cinderellas, looking at the Cinderella trope in folklore. And for this talk, I'm using 3 incredibly pivotal books that are all in the library and reference hall here at Dakshin. It's a wonderful resource for anyone who's interested in reading, for anyone who wants to pursue slightly higher level academic reading, and even for those who are serious researchers. Great collection of fiction and nonfiction books, a lot of wonderfully cataloged magazines. And for my talk, the 3 books that I used from the library are these. And the library has over 17,000 books, and it sees and the library sees several visitors. And if you want to reference something in the library or read, people are more than welcome to. They don't have to enter the museum; they can come directly. And it's a wonderful resource. And my talk especially focuses on the middle book, Cinderella, a case book, edited by Alan Dundes. Now, a little bit about the topic itself. What does folklore refer to? Now, folklore is basically a body of culture that belongs to any particular group of people. And why does it tell us about culture? Because it includes so many things. It includes the stories, the festivals, the clothes, the toys, the jokes, and the celebrations, and all of that. And what is a trope? A trope is something that is like a motif, if you think about a sari or a design, and it's something that is repetitive. So the idea of Cinderella, the story as we know it, is quite a common trope in several elements of folklore from around the world, and it has been so for the past 2,000 years. And so I thought it would be interesting to look at it, to see what we understand of it, to see how cultures shape the story, and also how the story in itself stands. Now, why study folklore? By studying people's culture, not only do we understand how stable or unstable it is, but it also makes us understand what led to these changes, or what leads to change. And folklore often does mirror the culture of the people, thereby making it pivotal to understand the people itself. Now, what does folklore do? They're projective systems. So by studying folklore, we're able to inductively certain aspects about the culture that we're studying. It also enables us to validate a certain culture, its rituals. Often what happens is very heteronormative narratives are given. And by studying culture and studying people that are not perhaps on the fringe allows us to lend it credibility and validation. And it's also a pedagogical device, and it helps us understand how stories and narratives are used as a mode of social pressure and social control. Now, folklore, as I said, is quite a wide and vast net to cast. So today, in studying the trope, I'm going to be looking primarily at only folktales or stories that are passed around in culture. Now, there are several types of folktales. You have traditional narratives, they don't really differentiate between living and inanimate things. So you have living and non-living things, stories about them. And then you have sagas, and sagas are when real people are introduced. Or there's Stith Thompson, who was a pivotal figure in categorizing folklore. He actually says that sagas are only restricted to tales that are about heroes. But our focus today is the Märchen, which is a German word that refers to stories that are most often told to kids and are romanticized or have elements of supernaturalism involved, and that are most often meant only for kids. And Cinderella is categorized as a Märchen. Now, regardless of whether a folktale is indigenous or borrowed in a given cultural context, it becomes very important to study it because, quick recap, 3 pivotal books in our library, wonderful library, over 17,000 books. If anyone's interested to come by, it's a great resource and archive for people who want art books, culture books, people who are academics who just want to spend an evening reading. And these 3 are the books that I used for my exhibition and my presentation. Again, the topic, what is folklore and what do you mean by trope, and why it's important to study Cinderella as a trope, because it is so frequent and recurring in folklore from around the world, cultures that are so far and apart and across time. Again, like I said, why study folklore? What does folklore tell us about the culture that it mimics or is from? And how, because folklore is such a large gambit, I'm going to be focusing my talk on folk tales, which are stories, and how Cinderella, the focus for today's talk, is a Märchen, which is a German word for stories that are told with supernatural elements in it, magic, and that are mostly meant for children. Regardless of whether a folktale is indigenous or is borrowed in a given cultural context, it is, when it's told and retold time and again, it'll start to reflect the ideology and the worldview of those who are actually saying the stories and also their audiences. So even in folklorists, there are anthropologically oriented folklorists and literature oriented. And while the anthropology enthusiast is interested in the way that folklore functions in a culture, the literary folklorist is more concerned with the lore element of it, the story element of it. But a true folklorist understands that the value of the text and the tale, but also tries to understand how it functions when it's being narrated in a group of people and with the group of people that it's being narrated to. And so both these terms, the folk, which refers to the people, and lore, which refers to the story, need to be taken into consideration when we're talking about any folklore. And as folklore is being written down now, initially it was all stories that were told and orally narrated. But now that it's being written down, obviously when you put something down, there is a lot of opportunity for you to edit it, correct it, make it look nicer, change certain things. This didn't happen before. So we also need to consider, as the medium of folklore changes, what are the changes that happen with it? And for anyone studying folklore, the way that we remember a story, perhaps when we were told by our grandmothers when we were young, if another family has the same story told to them, another child has the same story told to them, there are going to be changes, some subtle, some incredibly glaring. And we need to be able to understand it and incorporate it in our study of folklore, because it sort of enriches the space. Now, to the book of interest today is this lovely, lovely book It's Cinderella, a case book, and it's edited by Alan Dundes. Alan Dundes is an American folklorist who was a professor at the University of California in Italy. And he is pretty much credited with the way that we study modern folklore scholarship. And he was a preeminent in his field. And this book is a collection of 18 essays, and they're quite lovely because they not only give you these Cinderella stories from different cultures, but they also include different approaches whereby which the story is studied. And the book, I think, accomplishes two goals. It shows us by example how the range and spread of an individual item of folklore can be. Now, the topic is just Cinderella, and to sort of take that and see how far and wide the reach is and how different it is effectively shown by the book. Because you have stories from China, Tuscany, Karnataka, Afghanistan. And it also shows us the sort of data and theory that can blend into it. You have a Marxist reading, you have a feminist reading, you have someone who's mapped the topological instances of where the stories occur. So you realize how different certain methodology or certain theories how they enable different readings of the stories in the book. Start off, this is the oldest, one of the oldest European versions of the story we have. It's by a man named Giambattista Basile, an Italian, and his is not the first in Europe, it's just one of them. And I think the text is called Les Nouvelles Récréations et Joyaux de Vie, which is French. And it was released in 1558. And it's one of, there are earlier, and that text is earlier, but Basile's version was written in 1634. And he was actually the first person to take the idea of writing down these oral folk tales that existed. Now, in Basile's story, there is a girl who's named Zizola, and she obviously has a mother and father who love her very much, but the mother dies and the father remarries, and the stepmother is incredibly cruel. So Zizola complains to her governess, Kamasina, and a governess is basically someone who takes care of the girl. So she complains to her governess, and her governess says, okay, you know what, if you hate your stepmother, maybe tell your father about me so that he can marry me. And they plot to actually kill the evil stepmother. So the governess says, tell your stepmother that you want these old rags, and have her open a giant chest. And as the stepmother does this, Zizola brings down the lid of the chest on her neck, thereby killing her stepmother. And this allows her governess, Kamasina, to marry her father. And in the beginning, everything's great. Kamasina is so lovely to Zizola, and she's very happy. But slowly, you know, she has her own daughters, has 6 daughters, and Zizola becomes pushed to the background. And this is when a magical dove appears to Zizola and says, if you need anything, call out to us and we'll help you. And now the father goes on a trip to Sardinia on work. And when he asks his daughter, I want the fairy from the date tree. And her father goes out and he forgets about what Zizola asks so completely. And he realizes he can't return. He can't return because he's forgotten his promise to his daughter. And so he approaches the fairy, and the fairy gives him the seed to a date tree, a golden shovel, a golden can by water. And he brings back and he gives it to Zizola, and Zizola plants this date tree, and this magical dove sort of rests on it. And now there's a ball, and Zizola goes. Zizola's not allowed to go because she has 6 sisters that need to be married before her. And she slips away, obviously, because she goes to this date tree. The date tree produces these magical clothes and shoes for her. And she goes to the ball, but at strike of 12, she has to run back. And they follow her, but she escapes. And it happens 2 times. And the 3rd time, a servant of the king actually ties himself onto the chariot to sort of follow her. that doesn't happen, and one of her patterns fall off, and a pattern is a shoe with a raised sole, like a heel. That was used to sort of prevent your leg from getting caught in muddy waters. And the servant takes the shoe to the king, and again, like all Cinderella tales, they ask around everywhere, and the shoe fits nobody. And finally, they hold a feast, hoping this girl comes back, and she doesn't. But Zizola's father is there and says, "I have a daughter who's not here. Maybe you could try this. Maybe she could try on the pattern." And so the footwear is taken to her, and lo and behold, the footwear actually jumped to her foot, places itself on her feet, and she meets the prince, marries the prince, and they live happily ever after. But the tale that most of us are familiar with is Perrault's, because this is the most, I won't say simple, but it's the most palatable of the lot. He put out this tale in 1697, and it's called Cinderella or the Glass Slipper, and it's the most popular one. He was one who wrote Sleeping Beauty, Little Red Riding Hood, Puss in Boots, and it was in his book called Histoire au Conte du Temple. And this is the classic Cinderella story that's told in most, I guess, Disney films, where a father remarries, the second wife has two daughters, they're evil, they make Ella do her work, and she has to, the cinders, she works with the cinders, and so they call her Cinderella. There's Princess Ball, she wants to go, but she's not allowed to attend. The fairy godmother appears, turns the pumpkin into a carriage, turns 6 mice into horses, turns lizards into the coachman, gives her a glass and gives her a dress and glass slippers, tells her to come back before the clock strikes 12. She runs out, leaves the slipper, and she transforms so no one notices her. The prince comes looking, takes the shoe around, it fits nobody, but it fits only her, and then she's married off, transforms her. And the princess, being of kind heart, forgives the stepsisters, and they're also married off to wealthy lords. Now, this is obviously the nicest of all of the tales in the book, and this is perhaps why Disney has found it so convenient to interpret and produce it in sort of film form. Grimm, the brothers Grimm, they have the most popular version of the tale, but here towards the end it gets a little dark, and I think that's where Perrault's tale is taken over the Grimm tale. Where towards the end, when the shoe is actually brought, the stepsisters actually cut off their toes and their heel to be able to fit into the shoe. And they fit into the shoe, and the prince is willing to accept them. But there's a little bird that says, "Oh, look, the shoe is bloody. That's not the woman you want to marry." And then it goes to the other sister, who also cuts off her heel. And then finally the bird points to Cinderella, and she puts her foot in and it fits, and they get married. And in the marriage, the pigeons and the birds that were actually helping Cinderella throughout actually blind the sisters, the stepsisters. So towards the end, they're given the requisite punishment for the way they treated Cinderella, because they're blinded in the end of the story. You can see why Disney perhaps felt this was a little dark to convert into children's stories. But this is how the Grimm version of the tale ends. Now, to take a break from the versions of Cinderella, it's important to sort of sit back and ask ourselves, why is this tale so popular? Why there are so many folk tales, so many stories? Why does this trope occur so much? What is the psychological appeal of Cinderella? And Mary Jeffrey Collier wrote a paper whereby she asked a lot of teenage women and men why they loved Cinderella as a child. Now, obviously, if you ask a child, it's going to be quite difficult for them to articulate why this story has stayed with them. But as teenagers, to sort of look back and wonder why the story has stayed with you, they gave several reasons, but she categorized it into these 6 points. And they say the wish fulfilling character of Cinderella, the romantic love theme, the triumph over the evil stepmother and stepsisters, the magically evoked beauty, clothes, equipment, and surroundings. This is something that now with remakes and live action remakes, they really play on how more fantastical to make it. Then the fairy godmother's benevolent power, and how finally how Cinderella herself manages to overcome her obstacles. So these are some of the reasons why people go back time and again to the tale, and why it's in a way stood the test of time. As we see, the story has been used quite a bit, but something that people might not be aware of is that another incredibly famous writer has also used a version of the story in order to create an equally, if not equally, a slightly less famous tale, and that is Shakespeare. Cinderella has become such a part of Western culture that it can be found in most Western English dictionaries, the word itself. And you can call an underdog political candidate a Cinderella, or an athletic team that wins unexpectedly. And the plot of the story has inspired countless stories, novels, plays, and films. And one of the most famous being Shakespeare's King Lear. Now, this comes from an essay in the book by Alan Dundes himself, and it's called To Love My Father All, a psychoanalytic study of the folktale source of King Lear. And here you see that a tale called Catprushes. Now, in 1893, a folklorist by the name of Marion Rolfe Cox, she published her collection of Cinderella stories, and she published 345 variants of the story, and one of them is called Catprushes. Now, this is where Cinderella is an ill-treated heroine, and the father plays a very important figure. And here, it's sort of an outcast heroine who's heroine, and the story is where the father asks his daughters how much they love him, and the youngest daughter says, "I love you like I love salt, as much as salt." And the father deems it as an insult, so he banishes her. And in Shakespeare, later on, Cordelia is the youngest daughter. And you see that finally what happens, because the daughter meets a prince, marries a prince, and in the wedding banquet serves all the meals with no salt. And the father who attends the wedding meal realizes the import of what his daughter said, finally learns his lesson and forgives her and embraces her. Obviously, in Shakespeare's tale, Lear is the focus and not Cordelia. And there is an element of incest in the Catprushes tale, whereby the mother says, whoever my ring fits, the father will have to remarry. And it happens to fit her daughter, and so the father conspires to marry his own daughter. So that element of incest has also been removed in Shakespeare. But yeah, King Lear has also borrowed from the Cinderella trope, which I thought was very interesting. Now, the Chinese Cinderella, a lot of scholars believe that China might actually be the origin of the story, primarily because of the practice of foot binding. So as you know, in China, it's called lotus foot. A woman's foot was bound to retain its small shape. And the whole idea of Cinderella, where the small slipper fits no woman and fits only the petite feet of Cinderella, they believe that the idea of a ball, all of this could come from the Chinese tale. But because most of our culture, most of academics tends to be Eurocentric, Perrault and Grimm are the more popular ones. Grimm. Someone needs to mute themselves. So Perrault and Grimm are the more popular ones. Perrault, French, Grimm, German. Now the Chinese version comes almost 700 years before Perrault or Grimm, and it comes from a man. He is the chief of this cave called Wu, and he has a daughter called Shei Sein, and his wife passes away, and marries a woman who turns out to be an evil stepmother. And Shaysen finds this fish and she puts it in a little bowl. But every day she realizes the fish keeps growing and it outgrows whatever bowl she puts it in. And finally she saves it and puts it in a pond behind her house. And she feeds it every day. And every time she goes up to feed it, the fish sort of comes up, looks at her. The stepmother notices it and tries to catch a glimpse of the fish, but it never puts its head up when anyone else approaches it. The stepmother deceives the fish, puts on Shaysen's clothing, and the fish comes out, and the stepmother actually kills the fish and cooks it. And because the fish is 10 feet long at this point, it creates a wonderful meal. And Shaysen starts crying, and whereby an angel descends and says, don't worry about losing your fish. Your stepmother has killed it and cooked it. Just don't eat any of the meat of the fish, but take the bone and keep them and pray to them, and they'll give you whatever you want. And so that's what Shaysen does. She takes all the bones, keeps them with her, and prays. And there's a cave festival, which is the equivalent of a ball. And Shaysen prays to go, and she's given magical clothes, and she goes to the festival. But she realizes that she has to come back because her stepsister actually recognizes her at the festival. So she's rushing back, but she leaves a shoe behind with the cave people. To be from the trope kingdom. And they find the shoe and they look everywhere and they see, okay, they find Shaysen and she's married off to the prince of this trope kingdom. And the stepmother and their daughters receive retribution, and they're killed by flying stones. But the story goes forward whereby the prince actually sees these bones and he realizes that they have wish granting potential. And towards the beginning of their marriage, he asks for a lot of things and gets them. But slowly the bones stop granting him his every wish and they stop working. And then the prince obviously gets greedy, buries the stones, buries a lot of jewels. And when there's a rebellion in the kingdom, they find all this buried treasure, and the bones they sort of leave behind because they don't care. And the bones are sort of washed away. And this is the Chinese tale, which takes this small story of what we know as Cinderella and extends it and has an entire episodic history narrative woven into it. So that's quite beautiful. And then we have the Greek variant, whereby there's a spindle. We associate the spindle with the Sleeping Beauty tale that we're more aware of. But in the Greek variants, the girls are sort of spinning next to a cleft, which is sort of a deep cave or a pit. And Mara, who's very beautiful, she drops her spindle into the cleft. And so her mother is turned into a cow. And so the father remarries. The stepmother is incredibly evil. But the cow stays with Mara and helps her with her chores that she has to do. And the stepmother realizes there's something wrong and has the cow killed. And again, eats the flesh. And the mother, who's a cow, warns Mara and says, "Don't worry about me. Just bury the bones and don't eat any of my flesh." And so she buries the bones. There's a lovely tree that comes up, and there are doves on the tree that gives her the jewels and the clothes. And she goes to the ball, meets the prince. Again, she wears a silk slipper the first day. The second day, she wears a silver slipper. And the third day, she wears a gold slipper, which she leaves behind. And the prince finds the slipper, looks everywhere, finds Mara, gives her the footwear, and then they live happily ever after. Now, another variant whereby there are three sisters that are all spinning with their mother around a cleft. And they start getting hungry and they actually push the mother into the pit and kill the mother and eat her flesh. But the youngest one, who loves her mother very much, doesn't do it and buries the bones. And 40 days later, there's a tree and it gives her these beautiful dresses, and the story continues as is. Now, the African tale is incredibly interesting because here there's no fairy godmother, there's no tree, but there's a frog. It starts off very similar, but here what happens, the girl who's Cinderella is the focus. She actually is, whatever little food she's served, she gives to the frogs that live behind her house. And slowly the frog attend this ball, and the frog swallows her entirely and spits her out. And when the frog spits her out, she's dressed in these beautiful clothes, bangles, rings, and shoes. And it's funny because it says the first time the frog spits her out, she's a little tilted. So the frog swallows her and spits her out again, and now she's straight. And again, she leaves her footwear behind, and she leaves because she's worried that her stepmother will catch her. But when she comes back, the frog swallows her, spits her out, whereby she's dressed in her rags again, so no one recognizes her. And her stepmother, because she hasn't done all the chores, banishes her to her brother's house, who lives somewhere in the woods. And she goes there for food. And finally, the footwear is brought around, fits her, they're married, and they live a happy married life. And she brings the frog with her to the palace, and the frog tells her, "You're not done with your stepmother. You're just going to try something sneaky in order to get her daughter married to the prince." And it does happen. So when the stepmother and stepsister come into the palace and says, "What do you do as a princess? And how do you treat the other wives of the prince and other women in the palace?" Cinderella lies and deceives them in order to have them behave very inappropriately. And the stepsister believes it and behaves inappropriately to the prince's other wives and mother. And so she's chopped up and cooked and sent back to the stepmother, who thinks that, her daughter has sent her lovely dishes from the palace. So she actually ends up eating her own daughter. And Cinderella is reinstated to her position, and she houses the frog and builds a well for the frog in her palace. And that's how that tale ends. And you can obviously tell in the story, you have things like tuwo and fura, which are forages that are eaten in Africa. So you see how, even though the tale is the same, every story has these small elements that really reflect the culture of the place where it's from. Now, to take a little break from the different stories we've been seeing, I'd like to bring your attention to a little fun I came across. Now, this following item appeared in a paper in Winnipeg, in the US. It said, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a burglar lost his shoe as he was fleeing from the home of Mrs. M, aged 43. And the patrolman arrested Artie, who that's what they're calling the thief, and because he was sitting shoeless in a nearby bar. And authorities said that a shoe matching the one found in the broken into home was discovered behind the bar. And the headlines read, "Police use the Cinderella approach." So I thought it was a really fun way whereby the story has entered popular culture and in the news circuit. And it illustrates the popularity of the fairy tale in North America. And obviously it's because of the effort of the Grimm brothers, as well as very intentional effort of Walt Disney to pervade the cultural sphere with the story. Now for a tale that's very close to us, to our homes, the Kannada Cinderella. Now this is an A.K. Ramanujan chapter in the book, and he talks about how a woman has two children, a boy and a girl, and the girl is very beautiful and has lovely golden hair. But as she's growing up, her brother actually falls in love with her. And the mother is incredibly sad and doesn't know what to do. And so she gives her daughter a mask, a clay mask, and says, "Hide yourself, you can't stay here anymore, it's dangerous," and sends her away and kills herself. And the brother comes back, realizes that his sister is missing and his mother is dead, and he becomes a madman. And this girl goes off. She finds an old lady living in a wood, and she stays there. And the old lady sends her to the palace because they're having a banquet and she needs to cook. And she makes this lovely sweet rice. And because the banquet is in the orchard, she decides to take an oil bath inside. She takes off her masks, untangles her lovely golden hair. And here she's spotted by the prince, who falls in love with her beauty and says, "I have to marry you." And then they get married. But here there's an evil little advisor to the king, whose name is Guru Swami. And he becomes enchanted by the woman, Cinderella. And it's this in the story she's called Hanchi because it comes from Hanchu, which means mask, the Kannada word for mask. So Hanchi, Guruswami becomes obsessed with Hanchi and under false pretenses tries to woo her saying, I can help you have a child. And so creates enchantments on fruits and nuts. But Hanchi, being incredibly intelligent, feeds these fruits and nuts to a buffalo, and thereby the buffalo becomes besotted with Guruswami and attacks him in the effort of loving him. And then she feeds it to the vessels and the broomsticks, which then again try and attack Guruswami because now they're in love with him. Finally, in order to portray her as a dirty woman, Guruswami plants false evidence that she's seen multiple men, and then Hanchi is beaten and starved, and then she's put in a big box and sent off to the same old woman's house in the woods. And the old woman recognizes Hanchi and saves her, and instead puts a rabid dog in the big box. And when Guruswami comes to finally claim Hanchi in the box, the rabid dog attacks him, and he dies. And they hold a big feast whereby Hanchi makes her famous sweet rice. And the palace and the prince and the king realize the mistakes that they made and embrace Hanchi again. This story is incredibly interesting because here there's no slipper, there's no dresses, there's no idea of a ball, there aren't evil stepmothers or stepsisters, but you still see how the tale of a woman who meets and falls in love with a prince, marries him, and then has to overcome certain adversity in order to receive a happily ever after is woven, and how you have these magical elements that are quite linked to the folklore of Karnataka are woven in. Now, two motifs that I want to touch upon briefly before we come towards the close of this topic that I thought were very pertinent and were the slipper itself, which is actually in the design of the talk for this morning, and the name. Now, a lot of people believe that it was never meant to be a glass slipper because the French word for glass is verre, and the French word for fur is also verre. So they believe that sometime in the confusion of translation, fur slippers became glass. That's why there's such a fantastic notion of someone wearing glass slippers. But this is only a theory, not everyone accepts it. And Marion Rawls Cox, who I already mentioned, in her chronicling of 345 stories, she realized that only 6 of them actually have glass slippers. And even the original Grimm tales, they don't have glass slippers, they have silk, silver, and gold slippers that Cinderella actually uses. So glass is only seen in a very few of them. But people have read the glass motif as being very symbolic of Cinderella's virginity because, like virginity, it's fragile and once broken, cannot be got back. So that's how academics have read the idea of the glass slipper. But most European Cinderella traditions have the golden slippers, like the Grimm tale. Now, the name itself, in the Disney version, if you're familiar with it, the name is Ella. And because she works with cinders that are ash near the chimney, she's called Cinderella. And the German, the Grimm tale is actually called Aschenputtel, Ashen referring to ashes from the chimney. We saw the A.K. Ramanujan, the Kannada version, whereby she's called Hanchi, because it comes from the Hanchu, which is the clay mask that she wears. And you also have another story whereby she's called Maragopi, comes from Mara, which is the tree. And so you realize that the name of the story itself changes quite a bit, and it gives you a reference to a motif that's quite prominent in the story that refers to either a mode of hiding it or the work that she does. I would be remiss if we do an entire talk of Cinderella and I didn't talk about certain feminist critiques that are taken and spoken about. But I thought instead of looking at it head on, we'd look at how agency is expressed. Now, if you read the actual texts, you realize in the Grimm's last version of Cinderella, which was released in 1857, the girl in itself speaks only once in direct speech. And the bad women, the stepsisters, stepmother, they speak in direct speech 5 to 7 times. The prince, who's an authority figure, speaks in direct speech 8 times. And the father, who's absolutely ineffectual, has only 3. And 2 of them are thoughts. They're not even verbalized. But in the Danish variants, where women have greater freedom and power, Cinderella is not as silent or gagged as she is in the German stories. Now, it's just looking at a very simple element of the actual literature that's written around of the story. And it's an interesting thing because when we read the Indian version of these stories, it would be interesting to ask ourselves these questions, especially if there are differences in the way that men tell the stories and women tell the stories. And also because most academics happen to be male, do their biases seep into the way that they read the story as well? So if anyone's interested in reading several versions of a tale, these are some ways in which we can look at it in order to bring to it a larger scope of understanding. Now, to finish off the big kahuna, so they say, Walt Disney, in the book, Cinderella casebook, the last chapter is called America Cinderella, and it's by Jane Nolan. And she talks about how Walt Disney has corrupted the folktale. How in the original folktale, Cinderella is a woman of great action, of great resilience, but how she's been turned into a Disney princess, whereby she has very little things that she does and most things that happen to her. The original story, the original film was released in 1950 by Walt Disney, and it was highly anticipated. And but there are critics that call it an affirmation of an old faith, but without the miracle of it. And he mourned for the loss of the folkloric charm, which was replaced by sentimentality. And critics felt that Walt Disney was responsible for not only amplifying the stereotype of good versus bad women, as suggested by children's books, that's not actually evident in Grimm or Perrault, even for that matter. Disney was also criticized for this fantastical world that he created with cute little things and flowers and singing and songs and all of that, whereby removing the really powerful moving elements, retributive elements of the Martian and the German folktale and replacing it with this idea of false magic. And I think one very important thing to remember is that in the old tales, Cinderella is hardy, helpful, inventive, and she also is not very forgiving. But in the sort of mass market Cinderella that we've been given, she's meek, doleful, very petite, and it sort of makes you miss the powerful woman that was portrayed in the olden tales. And I think this is important for us to see as a closing to this discussion, because culture is not just something that happens in the past or that's given to us. It's ever creative, ever evolving, and culture is current. What we share amongst our friends and family now is going to be in posterity and read by future generation. So whether it's things like jokes, ads, songs, people might say, why are you getting so hung up on these things and reading into them? But I think you read into them because they do reflect so much of our thinking and so much of what we believe as a society. So in a place like Dakshin Chitra, handles culture as something that's always evolving, that's living, it's a living museum. I feel like this talk encompasses both the need to understand culture and zeitgeist is not something that are only passed on to us or is current, but something that is held on for posterity. And so with that, I'd like to finish my presentation. These are some of the books and papers that I referred to for my talk. They're incredibly useful. I found most of them online. So if anyone's interested, please reach out to us. You can reach out to us via email or on Instagram. And if you're interested in any of the bibliographic references, I'm more than happy to share them with you. They're very short but very informed reads. And yeah, that is the close. Thank you very much. I think we have 13 minutes for questions. If anyone wants to ask a question or share perhaps certain stories that you've heard told by your parents, grandparents, friends, or certain film interpretations of Cinderella. I haven't really touched upon that, but if there's something you want to share, then that would be really nice as well. Otherwise, I'd like to finish my talk. And thank you very much. Obviously, I'm incredibly indebted to Mrs. Indumati Mohan, who's our librarian here at Dakshin Chitra, for her relentless help at any given point in time. I'd also like to thank our publicity coordinator, Parvati, who was instrumental in putting together this Zoom thing. So yes, I'll just go back to the first slide. And yeah, if any of you have any questions, I guess we'll take them now. You can unmute yourself, or if there are no questions, then we can slip very easily into the next presentation we have today, a wonderful talk about the Neolithic age by my fellow intern, Anandu Manoj. So yeah, thank you.
Hi, Sandhya?
Yes.
Hi, Lakshmiya.
Lakshmiya, hello.
Hi, it's quite fascinating to hear such stories. I just got to read in terms of lots of folk tales from all the southern states.
Yeah.
Somewhere that I always believe that, we have Cinderella even in Tamil, Telugu, Kannadam, So the characters like, very tamed, vulnerable, good-hearted people are always Cinderella for us, really, in all 5 southern state folk tales, really. You touched upon that very well, really. It's quite nostalgic to me, really, and great. Thank you to take us through this.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I'm more than happy. I think, like I said, I found it fascinating as well. And there are several books in the library that deal with folk tales from the South, and especially in Tamil Nadu. And you read them and you realize how similar or different they are. And it really is a fascinating comparative study. And I'm so glad that it was interesting to someone else, as interesting as it is to me. So thank you so much. Yeah. There is something in the chat. Okay, Ashita. Thank you so much. Even with a surprising amount of accidental cannibalism, yes, I think cannibalism is actually a huge part of the European and Middle Eastern Cinderellas, because you have a lot of the stepmother turning the mother into a cow or some other animal, or having her killed, eating it. The bones of this mother being saved by Cinderella, which thereby either turns into a tree or ground fishes. So cannibalism is a huge, huge part of the tale that most people aren't aware of. I think they excluded so that, to make it more appropriate for kids. But yes, a lot of cannibalism, accidental. Thank you so much, Ashita, for your comment. Okay. Are there any questions? I don't want to take up too much of your time. So again, thank you so much. I had a wonderful time hosting this, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk about something that I think is very interesting. If you know someone that might enjoy this talk or that might enjoy the presentation, again, reach out to us on Instagram or via email. I'm more than happy to share the sources, the presentation itself. And please, anytime anyone wants to come to Dakshin Chitra, do check out our reference hall. It's a wonderful treasure trove of sources. So yes, thank you. And yeah, we have a very interesting little comment by Vinayak Bhatt. Does the famous image of O.J. Simpson's gloves not fitting in the courtroom qualify as reverse Cinderella of sorts? Thank you for the engaging topic. Thank you, Vinayak, for joining us. Yes, that's actually a moment. I'm not sure if everyone is aware, but O.J. Simpson, in the courtroom scene where he was being indicted, tried for the murder of his wife, they tried to put on the gloves and it doesn't fit him. And that was sort of regarded as the moment whereby Simpson's defense team won, because they could prove that because the gloves couldn't fit Simpson's not culpable. And it was an incredibly important cultural moment in terms of US law. And I guess it does qualify as reverse Cinderella of sorts. There are actually several hero tales that Marion Woolf Cox she catalogued, and she called them hero tales, whereby it wasn't a heroine like Cinderella, but it was a man or a boy who was in the same position, but very similar tale of events, similar motives. So you actually have several Cinderella stories whereby the lead is a man or a boy. But yeah, I guess this does qualify as reverse Cinderella. Thank you for that very insightful and fun little reference. It's great to see it. Thank you, Vinayak.